Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 173. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, May the 30th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Podcast today, we'll talk about the paranormal, UFOs, Bigfoot. And this whole paranormal phenomenon was not something that began in the late 1980s when Art Bell took to the airwaves. This has been something that's been going on for hundreds, thousands, many thousands of years. Basically, since there has been man. And we'll talk about that, why we are just infatuated with paranormal activity. And is it really something that's just made up? Some people say it is. Is it something that's definitely factual? Some people say that it is. But we'll talk about paranormal activity throughout history and note different snapshots in time where people basically believe the exact same thing that you see on Ancient Aliens or will see on Ancient Aliens tomorrow. A lot of that has not changed. We'll talk about that. Paranormal activity throughout history. But first, before we get into that, I wanted to give you a status update on the podcast, as I like to do every once in a while, okay, where we're at, what we're doing, the numbers, etc. The James Strong Show podcast, as the James Strong Show when it was on terrestrial radio, is a news of the day formatted podcast, okay? Not necessarily the first headline news, but sometimes a different spin on first headline news. Sometimes the stories that, in my opinion, are very important, but maybe aren't discussed in the first, second, third, fourth, 10th, 14th news story of the day in traditional media sources, okay? Often I do essays on major happenings, but maybe a different perspective on that happening. Sometimes I'll do interviews and conversations with others on a variety of topics. I'd like to do them in studio. With the pandemic going on, I've put that on hold, but I've done them via long line, via telephone, which the audio quality has been anywhere from really good to not so much. Never as good as somebody sitting in the studio either. But I also like to do podcasts on paranormal activity. Recently, I've done it on Skinwalker Ranch, the whole Bilderberger Illuminati Trilateral Commission, UFOs, Bigfoot. I will also tell you that through my podcast host, Spreaker, I get statistics on who's listening, how many are listening, where are they listening from. And I will tell you that the ratings on my podcast, they're not consistent. They go up and they go down, and then they go up and they go down by the topic. And I will tell you that the ratings for the podcast that I do on the skinwalkers, on the UFOs, on the Bigfoot, etc., I get about double the listeners from any other topic, okay? Occasionally, if I have a very interesting guest who also has a big following, I get the fantastic numbers too. But the big numbers come from those types of podcasts, okay? Skinwalker, UFO, Bigfoot. Now, what do I do? What to do? How about this? How about give the people what they want? Now, the podcast is not turning into a version of Coast to Coast, but certainly I will be doing more on the paranormal, more on skinwalkers, more on UFO, more on Bigfoot, etc. Not exclusively, but certainly more, because that's what it seems like the folks want to hear. And the bigger the audience, in my opinion, the better job I'm doing. Okay. Now, next next week, I'm actually going back on the road with the day job, and I will be traveling across the Midwestern United States into Ohio, Indiana, etc. And I'll give a synopsis on what I've found. Business travel, just getting out and about during the pandemic. So that'll be next week. But this week, we're going to talk about the history of the paranormal. Now, the paranormal, fact or fiction, opinion or reality, science versus popular opinion. Now, during this pandemic, this whole pandemic has certainly blurred the firewall between the two, between fact and fiction, between opinion and reality, between science and popular opinion. And actually, to be fair, the firewall isn't so much blurred, but it has been moved. And often moved because often that firewall has just been a facade. Let's say that, okay? Take the smart people. And I've said this, many people have said this, and in my opinion, the prudent people believe this. With the pandemic and with most things in life, okay? Listen to the smart people. Now, who have the smart people been during the pandemic? Arguably the smartest person that everybody is trying to listen to, myself included, I respect him, is Dr. Fauci. Now, in January, Dr. Fauci said, this pandemic's no big deal. It's not going to be a big deal in the United States. Now, it's a big deal. In February, Dr. Fauci said, there's no need to wear a mask in public. That's not necessary. Now, wear your mask in public to stop the spread to others in case you're asymptomatic. Now, I'm not marginalizing the smart people here, okay? I'm just pointing out that their stances change, but they change with the introduction of new evidence, or perhaps a reevaluation of the results of that evidence. Another case in point that's very similar. I'm building my case here for the reason for the podcast, for the topic. Look at the stock market. So many of these soothsayers of the stock market get it wrong, okay? But one guy always gets it right. It's never the same guy, but everybody has predicted some type of stock market activity to the T. But it's always a different individual, okay? Now, is that one person who got it right, is he the smartest guy in the room? Or is he just, during a snapshot in time, the luckiest during a certain occasion or event, okay? Is he just the flavor of the day? Often, that's the case. He's not necessarily the smartest, but just because he gets it wrong the next time doesn't mean he's a dummy either, okay? Does that make sense? I hope it does. Now, many of the explanations for many situations with a variety of conclusions, that's that way for everything, okay? 10 people have 10 ideas based on the same data, but they come up with different results and a different potential conclusion. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. What's the right way to handle this pandemic? Well, history will reveal who got it right, who got it wrong, what was prudent and what was silly. With the pandemic right now, if I hear one thing consistent from all the smart people, is no one knows for sure. No one. I'm going to repeat that because it's very important. Nobody knows for sure. The smart people, the really smart people, are not saying, look, this is the way things are during the pandemic. And they stick to that story 100%. They don't do that. They either say, I don't know, or they change their story based on new facts, new data. That's what smart people do, okay? Now, consider paranormal activity. UFOs, Bigfoot, Skinwalker Ranch. Now, most of the really smart people, the super smart people around, they basically discount this type of talk as silliness, especially the super smart ones. Now, please consider these facts before damning the believers in the paranormal, which, by the way, that's me. Much of this I do believe is factual. But please consider these facts before damning the believers like me, damning us as, damning us as simple-minded, just simple-minded sheep, I guess, who ignore the facts and spin yarns like uneducated Neanderthals. Okay, consider these three facts. About 600 years ago, the smartest people in the world were convinced that the earth was flat, that the sun and the planets rotated around the earth. It wasn't until Copernicus proved them wrong, and it took a lot of doing to prove them wrong. Before Copernicus, the smartest people in the world were positive that the sun and the planets rotated around the earth. Absolutely positive. It wasn't a theory, it was a fact. And they were wrong. 150 years ago, doctors, before surgery, surgeons, they didn't even wash their hands before operating on patients. I read a book on James Garfield that was recommended to me by Karen Gutting, who's been a guest on the podcast. But the doctors that operated on Garfield was one of the presidents who was assassinated. And actually he was shot, and the bullet that entered his body wasn't a fatal wound. In fact, modern day doctors say, look, if they had just left him alone, let him heal, left the bullet inside of him, Garfield probably would have recovered completely within a matter of months. Instead, the doctors kept probing and checking things out and digging for a bullet that they couldn't reach. And every time they did that, they didn't even wash their hands. In other words, they introduced germs and bacteria into a originally fairly clean wound, and Garfield died basically of sepsis. The doctors killed him. Had he just gone home, put a poultice on the wound, in a couple of months, he'd have been fine. But the smartest guys in the room, the doctors, didn't even think it was necessary to wash their hands before operating on patients. In fact, they thought that the smell and presence of pus on a wound was the wound's way of cleaning itself, because oftentimes it did. No, that was just an infection that if the person was strong enough and the doctors left it alone long enough, the body would cure that infection out of the wound. The doctors just made it worse every time they'd go in there and monkey with it, okay? Those were the smartest people in the room at that time. Number 3, a large percentage of super smart people, dare I say even those of genius status, are atheists. In fact, they believe belief in God, that's silly. It's silly to believe in God. You can't see him, you can't feel him, you can't touch him, you cannot prove his existence, which, by the way, that's all true. There's no way you can prove God exists. Faith is what people have that believe in God. In fact, I know one individual who is off the chart smart. And he thinks that, in fact, he doesn't believe in God, even though he was raised in going to Catholic schools. Doesn't believe in God, thinks it's silly now. When he was a boy, but that's a childhood myth. It's silly. But he believes in black holes, okay? How can you prove a black hole? You can't touch it. You can't prove it. You look at it through a telescope, and you think that it's this because it's obviously this. So the super smart people, the geniuses, while they don't believe in God, that's silly. They believe in black holes, which I guarantee sometime in the next 100 years, the current belief they now have in black holes that the smart people, the geniuses, say is fact, will be disproven by somebody. And I say that because that's the way things have always been in astronomy. Always. Okay. Now, my point here is not that the smart people aren't smart, because they are. I mean, these people, or when they compare them to me, there is no comparison, okay? But over time, like with the